Hello guys and welcome back to the channel. So in this video I'm going to play for you what Adam Spice has said at the Bank of America Securities conference. This happened I believe 2 days ago, and he gives out fantastic data. Like, these conferences give me way more data than the earnings calls, because on the earnings calls there's stupid analysts asking stupid questions and they're answering them, but here it's more like Adam is presenting what is important about the company, and they give very surprising things about how they attract talent. I got a very surprising answer on that. What happened with Neutron budget now that Neutron is delayed 2 years, how they're planning to, within 3 to 5 years, have their own space infrastructure. He gives the growth rate for their space systems and the launch industry going forward, and lots of other very, very valuable tidbits. So again, I think I'm going to be making a habit about posting Adam Spice on these conferences, because really it's way better than what the conference calls give. So I'll give you Adam Spice. It's really worth a listen. If you enjoyed this content, please just subscribe. And if you want to go further, support the channel, you can join the channel membership. Thank you so much. And here's the conference for you.
Thank you all for coming. We've got Rocket Lab here, Adam Spice, financial officer, and Patrick Vornkamp, a financial analyst. So thank you guys for coming. So, as far as I'm concerned, no offense to any other company, these guys do some of the coolest shit that's going to happen and be spoken about at this conference. So, anyway, without further ado, why don't we just, for the folks that aren't as familiar with Rocket Lab, Adam, if you could just kind of at a high level tell everybody what Rocket Lab is and does, and that'd be great.
Sure. So, as you can tell by the name, Rocket Lab's got something to do with rockets, and that's how we started. So Rocket Lab started off focused on a new class of vehicle called small dedicated launch vehicles. And so we have a vehicle called Electron, and Electron has flown 47 times. We've got our 48th flight coming up in the next week or so, with a pretty busy manifest for 2024. So we generate about 30% of our revenue from launch and about 70% of our revenue from the other part of the business that people aren't as familiar with, which is space systems. So think of space systems as anything to do with the actual satellite itself. So we've got the launch piece, we've got the satellite piece. Within the satellite part of the business, we've got a merchant component business where we sell key subsystems into the broader small satellite ecosystem. Customers including, companies like Lockheed and Northrop Grumman and other smaller small satellite manufacturers. And then we also provide on-orbit services, so we operate satellites for customers on orbit. We actually design and manufacture full satellite systems. So we have about 45 satellites in backlog right now. The two larger parts of that backlog are about exactly 17 satellites for Globalstar MDA. And then we have just recently been awarded a $515 million contract for 18 satellites as part of the Space Force's SDA platform, so the Low Earth Orbit Proliferated Warfighter Platform. Within our launch platform, we have commercial launches, government launches. Within the government launches, we actually have a new line of business there where we're supporting hypersonics test platform work, so launching out of Wallops, Virginia for that part of our business. We have launch pads in New Zealand and in Wallops, Virginia for Electron. And then, our biggest initiative right now is developing a medium-class launch vehicle called Neutron. Neutron is going to be a reusable 13-ton vehicle that's going to fly 13-ton payload capacity, flying out of Wallops, Virginia as well. And that's really to bring more capacity and capabilities to the medium launch category, which has really been winnowed down to really one primary provider right now, which is SpaceX. So SpaceX has a very uncomfortable, I would say, position in that market where, a lot of things have conspired to make it so that they're really the only active provider today of note. A lot of it's geopolitical. I think people were not necessarily anticipating the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and what that would do to the supply chain for rockets. But if you think about, engine dependency was there from Russia-Ukraine for Northrop Grumman's Antares rocket, for ULA's vehicles. And so it's really kind of upended the industry, and we look to bring Neutron into that market to provide some much needed diversity and incremental capacity.
And maybe just as a place to kick off, if you could just maybe describe the difference between Neutron and Electron. And just bear in mind, I was just out in the their hangar building, and one is huge, one's not so huge. But if you can give folks just a sense on scale.
Yeah. So they're very, very different vehicles. So if you so Electron, which is the second most frequently flown U.S. vehicle behind the Falcon 9, is about a 70-foot tall vehicle. It's a 3-stage vehicle. It's capable of putting a 300-kilogram payload into low Earth orbit. It's also deployed payloads out of low Earth orbit. In fact, about 2 years ago for NASA, we were the first part of the Artemis program, and we delivered a payload on a trajectory to the moon. So we have what's called Capstone. So we delivered a payload to the moon, which was a very, very cool mission. And so you think about a refrigerator-sized payload that we can deploy into low Earth orbit on Electron, or multiple smaller payloads, and on Neutron it's very different. It's a vehicle capable of delivering 13 tons, so almost 40 times the capacity of Electron. So that's really designed to be a constellation deployment vehicle, very much like a Falcon 9. It could also do large individual single satellite dedicated launch missions as well. But they're similar in some ways and they're different in some ways. And the similarities are the fact that both are carbon composite structured vehicles. So we were the first to innovate around carbon composite structures for launch vehicles. The benefits of the carbon composite approach is that it's much lighter than stainless steel or aluminum, and it's very rigid. So if you get it right, it provides a lot of benefits to giving you more mass throw capability. We're also leveraging a lot of the avionics capabilities from Electron, because a lot of the time the flight computers and other things don't really care whether it's a large launch vehicle that is controlling or a small launch vehicle. So a lot of learnings from 47 flights are going into Neutron. And then propulsion is probably the biggest change. So Electron has a very novel propulsion system. So it's a electronic fuel-injected rocket engine, essentially electro-turbo pump design, where we pressurize the fuel pumps discharging about 1 megawatt of lithium-ion battery power, versus Neutron, which is a different propulsion cycle. It's an oxidizer-rich cycle, which is a much more complex piece of machinery and it looks more like a traditional rocket engine than Electron's rocket engine, which looks very different because it's very simplified. So one of the other key things is we've now been bringing back the first stage of Electron for reusability, and we also recently, about 6 weeks ago or so, brought back a payload from orbit for a company called Varda Space, where we built that satellite for them, and then we re-entered the capsule with the pharmaceuticals that they manufactured on orbit. So a lot of R&D has gone into re-entry capabilities. So, and that's one of the key things about Neutron is Neutron was designed from day one to be a reusable launch vehicle, and so all the economical, the benefits that go into being able to scale that business with a reusable vehicle is something that we're very much looking forward to.
And then on Neutron, where is the company in the development of it, and when do you expect it to first fly, and so on and so forth?
So I spent 25 plus years in the semiconductor industry before coming to the wild and crazy business of rockets. But I always thought that there was nothing more complex than mixed signal semiconductors, and I was really wrong, actually. Rockets are way harder. Not only just from a technology perspective, but also just from like the geopolitics involved and things like ITAR controls and limitations that puts on your ability to kind of share technology across borders and stuff. But we are well on the way. We had originally had, when we came public in August of 2021, we set a date for first launch of Neutron at the end of 2024. On our earnings last week, we announced that we were pushing that schedule out by 2 quarters, so now we're targeting the middle of 2025. Primary drivers for that push are, the propulsion system is typically the longest pole in the tent, and in this case, it's the most novel part of the new architecture is the propulsion system, so that has taken us longer. Partially due to the fact that it's there's, again, you come across things you don't necessarily anticipate. There's also this, sometimes there can be staffing challenges and scaling up as quick as you'd like to. You've got dependence on third-party providers for portions of the system and so forth. But if you think about the key areas of a rocket development program, there's really 4 primary work streams. There's propulsion, which is always the longest and the riskiest. Then you've got structures, which are basically your tanks and your fairings and so forth. And for that, we feel really good about because, again, we've done a lot of those for Electron. And then you've got avionics, which is basically the guidance sets and all things that control the flight of the vehicle. And again, we're leveraging that from Electron to Neutron. And then the last piece, or 4th work stream, is really infrastructure. And by infrastructure, it means manufacturing infrastructure, so factories, and also pad. So you have to build a different pad for this new launch vehicle. So all of those things are actually moving pretty well, but at some point just the clipping the milestones on propulsion, we're just delaying to the point where even though the engineering team didn't want to give up the end of year launch, Pete, our CEO, and kind of the rest of the management team just had to make a judgment call and say, look, it's, we no longer think we can reliably hit that date, so let's give ourselves what we think is a more appropriate kind of delivery time frame, which is the middle of next year. But one of the key milestones was really getting this new Archimedes engine for Neutron to the test stand in Stennis, Mississippi, and we accomplished that last week. And so our goal and our belief is that we'll be able to see fire coming out of that engine before the end of this quarter. And that's really, once you have an engine that's working, or you know how it's working, you can have much higher confidence about kind of the rest of the program coming together. Because largely you want these things to kind of march in parallel. I think at this point, though, kind of some of the infrastructure stuff and other parts of the vehicle are progressing a little bit beyond the propulsion side. So propulsion's got to catch up, and then it's always, again, the gating item.
And then, I think it's cool, so I'm going to ask you this, right? How do you recover Neutron?
So Neutron's got a couple different options. So the initial approach for recovery is very much like the Falcon 9, where you'll see it land downrange on a barge. So call it like 400 kilometers downrange. And in a downrange landing configuration, again, the vehicle has about 13 ton of payload capacity. But the other is actually the second approach, which we'll phase in over the program, is basically return to launch pad. So that's where the rocket takes off and then returns right back to where it took off from on the pad, which obviously helps a lot because you don't have the cost of deploying barges, and then it's obviously provides an opportunity for much quicker reusability. So we're very excited about that. There are some steps that we still need to kind of get through, including some of the environmental and regulatory stuff with NASA to be able to do that at the Wallops range, because to my knowledge, nobody's ever done a return to pad at this point, so it's kind of a novel approach, but again, could have huge benefits if and when we get that approved.
And then, if we just kind of rewind the clock to when we first started talking, we should have been swimming in launch providers today, and we're not. What is it about the launch industry that's made it that it's really kind of just of the private launch providers, you guys and SpaceX? Why don't we have all these other players around, and what makes launch so hard?
I think launch is inherently hard because it's such a complex piece of machinery. So Electron, for example, the rocket that takes 300 kgs of payload to orbit, it's got like 66,000 parts, and there's no insignificant part, right? Any little thing can cause a potential anomaly. So, I think it's just there's so many elements of technology risk that you have to buy down over the development period. And I think it's a very capital-intensive business. And so, for example, I think, to your point, Ron, we were supposed to be swimming in launch providers. Kind of look at what's happened. You've had people like, Astra, for example, came public around the same time we did. They said they were going to launch, 300 times a year, which, I was kind of squinting at the time, going, 300 times a year? You don't even have 300 days of clear weather to launch. So, that was kind of, to me, that was a big head scratcher, and ultimately that didn't materialize. You had folks like Virgin Orbit. Virgin Orbit came public again around the same time. They went bankrupt. We ended up benefiting from their bankruptcy in the fact that we were able to acquire a factory 2 blocks down the road that was fully equipped, that was had about $100 million investment into it, and we were able to pick that up for $16 million, which really actually helped us kind of drive our Neutron development, because we basically walked into a turnkey factory that we could gain schedule and capital cost advantage on. But the challenge with Virgin Orbit was they had the different architecture, where it was a captive carry, so you put it under the wing of a 747, get up to 35,000 feet, drop it, and it goes. But they had launch failure after launch failure, and they ran out of capital, and I think that was their challenge. And you've got the problem is, again, it's very capital intensive. If you make a mistake, it's very difficult to recover from. Yeah. And so once you kind of go down that wrong path from a development or architecture perspective, it's very difficult to recover. And the capital markets, as we all know, aren't what they were back in 2021. So as people have kind of depleted their precious capital, they find themselves in a very awkward situation where they really can't raise any more. And I think the private markets are are even worse. So I think we're now down to, if you kind of look at the launch landscape today, we're the clear, dominant provider in small dedicated launch. We're the only one that's really operating at cadence at all. You've got on the medium class launch, you've got SpaceX. Northrop Grumman basically left the market for medium class with their Antares due to their Russian-Ukrainian engine dependence. ULA Vulcan is not there yet. They've had one test launch. And then you've got Blue Origin's New Glenn vehicle, which is not yet launched. So you've got a handful of current and potential providers. And I think that the one thing that the customer and the market really needs is they need another high cadence, cost-effective medium launch provider beyond SpaceX. And I think the market really looks, and we look to ourselves to be that high cadence, low cost, really commercially oriented launch provider.
So if Neutron goes the way you hope it will, right? And how big a market is it potentially for? How much demand is there for a Neutron-sized launch and for Electron-sized launch? So if we were to walk out, just like thought experiment, and not a future guide, to be clear, but you walk out 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how much demand is there for this kind of launch?
If you look at, there's a lot of third-party research out there, Northern Sky Research and Euroconsult that provide figures on those that, people are pointing at, tens of thousands of satellites per year need to be launched. I think we can look much more tangibly today and say, look, if you look, SpaceX launched, I think they launched roughly 95 times last year, might be 98. And around 80% of that volume was driven by Starlink launches. So, Starlink being kind of one of the early, obviously, internet broadband from space providers. But you've got Amazon, Project Kuiper coming up behind that. You've got, OneWeb Gen 2. You've got Telesat Lightspeed. You've got the government SDA tranches, which are just going to, just starting. You've got NRO programs that are similarly looking at low Earth orbit, proliferated constellation opportunities. So the demand is clear. I mean, right now there's a clear lack of capacity. And just to be, when you kind of think about it, in fact, there's a lot of people out there who are building business models that compete with Starlink, yet they're dependent upon SpaceX to launch their satellites. So that's a very, very, very uncomfortable, tenuous situation to be in if you're running one of those constellation companies. So, we look to be able to provide some incremental capacity there. So I think that and just for example, what very public Amazon Kuiper bid out, I think it was 84 launches last year, and they awarded it to 3 providers: ULA Vulcan, Ariane 6, and Blue Origin New Glenn. And of those 3 providers, 2 of the rockets haven't been completed yet, haven't launched. Vulcan's had 1 launch. So that's just one kind of set of launch bids for a portion of their constellation. And when we look at our opportunity for Neutron, I mean, we'll have 1 launch next year, and our cadence is kind of 1, scale to 3, scale to 5, and that's really based on our experience with Electron. I think our biggest opportunity is how do we unleash the potential of this reusable vehicle more quickly? Because there's no question. I mean, there's a lot of things that keep Pete and I up at night in running this space business, but demand for Neutron is absolutely not one of them.
Gotcha. And maybe changing gears a little bit, because we spoke so much about launch, the other side of the business. If you can talk about what you guys do in terms of subsystems, satellites, satellite parts, all that, everything.
So if you look at our goal really, if you step back, is to become an end-to-end space company, and what we view as part of that is you've got the satellite subsystems that go into building the satellites. So we have a subsystem business that sells things like attitude, direction, and control components, which are things like reaction wheels and star trackers, torque rods, and so forth. It's things that help stabilize and orient the satellite on orbit so it can do its job, such as pointing it over the Ukraine at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon to take images over a certain region, right? So it's the pointing and stability of the satellite. So we sell subsystems that are oriented around that. We sell actually the software that does the command and control of those satellites in orbit. So if you've got a constellation, you need to, when you're waking up and tasking your satellite constellation, we own the software that does that, and we sell that into the merchant market. We sell solar solutions, so germanium compound semiconductor solar cell solutions into that market, service a lot of national security missions. And then we also own a business that sells separation systems, which are basically the devices that sit on the rocket and are also connected to the satellite, and they're basically what deploy the satellite. They're mechanical systems that eject the payloads from the rocket. So we sell all of those things in the merchant market. Today, it's call it a $140 million run rate business, and growing quite nicely. Call it a 20%-ish CAGR. And then we have a satellite manufacturing business where we actually design and manufacture whole satellite systems for customers. And so those are the kinds of satellites that we do for customers like NASA. We've got 2 satellites that are going to launch later this year to Mars that are going to map the magnetic poles of Mars. So most people wouldn't think of Rocket Lab as building full satellite systems for customers like NASA. We do those. We build full satellite systems for, again, a company called Varda Space, which does in-space pharmaceutical manufacturing. We just won that contract with the SDA to build 18 of their very sophisticated satellites, and we're the prime on that mission. So if you look at our backlog, we've got about $1 billion of backlog. About $800 million of that backlog is space systems. Of that $800 million of space systems, it's about, call it $650 million, roughly, of the actual satellite themselves, and then $150-ish million of the components business, and then the rest, the other $200 million is launch.
Gotcha. And could you speak a little bit to the SDA constellation, because that in total is what, a $515 million contract, and you're prime.
Yep.
So that was the first one you guys were prime on, I think, right?
That's the first prime mission that we've gotten, which so that does a lot of things. I think so. We had been a bus provider into the Global Star constellation, but being the prime is actually for us it's a much better position to be in, because it obviously gives us more share of the platform from a dollar perspective. So in this case, we're providing the bus, and as we talked about, we basically are so vertically integrated on the bus that we buy very little from third-party providers for the bus. It's largely all kind of Rocket Lab content. But when it comes to the payload, that's an area that we don't have capabilities. So we basically partner and subcontract the payload elements out to people like Raytheon and others. But our goal over time is to own that as well. So our goal is to kind of continue to kind of expand our share of wallet on these platforms. And part of it is because obviously we want to provide growth to the business, and we're expanding our addressable market when we move up the food chain. But at the same time, we also just de-risk on-time delivery and performance and cost competitiveness. So we don't necessarily look at the platform and say, like, what are the sexiest pieces of technology that we think we want to own. It's more of, what are the biggest headaches on the platform, and how can we eliminate headaches by owning that, bringing it under our roof where we can manage it, bring our scale and our capabilities to it, and also allow a different level of overall architectural differentiation where you can do things differently when you control all the various elements. You don't have to just take something that's going to give you with a certain form factor, a certain mass, and a certain set of capabilities. You can say, well, if we had this element of the payload, or if we had this element of the bus, we can make it smaller, we can make it lighter, or we can basically split certain amounts of the functionality from that subsystem to another subsystem to come together with a better, more holistic architecture. Because a lot of what you see in traditional aerospace primes is they don't build a lot of stuff. They just buy a lot of stuff from other people, and they basically put it together. Where we take a very different view of, we don't want to just buy stuff from other people and put it together. We want to kind of design an optimized overall system, and in order to do that, you need to have more control of all the various pieces that go into that. So that's really kind of what drives kind of how we think about what parts of the ecosystem we want to play in. And so, earlier this year in February, we went out and raised a $355 million convert. And, a lot of people ask the question, well, what is that going to be used for? Is it really used for kind of getting Neutron finished off, or what is it? Well, it's really for pursuing more of those vertical integration opportunities on the satellite side of things. And then ultimately long term is, how do we start to dip our toe in the application side of the market, because that's actually the biggest kind of part of the overall space ecosystem, are applications, or kind of monetizing the data that you get from the assets on orbit. So if you look forward, 3 to 5 years from now, I would fully expect that we own assets on orbit that we're monetizing on a recurring basis and getting that recurring revenue stream going at very high gross margins once you get that capex deployed. And since we own so much of the ability to put assets on orbit, we should be able to do that in a more cost-effective way than others. I think we've kind of seen that playbook play out with SpaceX and Starlink. It's very difficult for other people to do what SpaceX has done unless you have a vertically integrated model, including a reusable launch vehicle. So we've kind of seen what that playbook to success looks like, and I think that very few organizations on the planet have been able to put together a rocket, which is the hardest piece. So it comes back to your question, we're supposed to be drowning in launch providers, we're not. Well, we actually think if you don't have your rocket, you're going to be in a very uncomfortable place long term as a player in the space market.
Yeah, interesting. Because nobody can just do launch, right? I mean, they'll end up doing other stuff, right?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, launch is so hard because, again, you don't have to just develop really difficult technologies, but you have to have the capital to build that infrastructure. And then customers have to be motivated to take risk on a new platform. So your timing into the market is super important too. So, for example, the reason why Electron was given the opportunity it was given was because until Electron came along, if you were going to launch let's say, for example, a national security payload or any other where you needed a dedicated launch, so you can't put it next to, a dozen other satellites on a rideshare mission, but you need your own dedicated launch, you would pay at times $300 to $500 million to ULA to do that, or you'd spend $100 million with SpaceX to do that. Well, we came into that market and said, well, we'll do it for less than 10, and actually build a business on it. So that's really, so the customers go, well, if it was 20% cheaper, probably not. But when you're 1/10 of the cost, that's what makes customers lean forward and take risk. So timing is super important. So I think it feels like we've passed that point where customers can come in, where competitors, can come in and really kind of disrupt the launch market, because on the small dedicated side, we sell a launch for, let's say, 7 to 10 million. If somebody comes in and offers, a new launch provider comes in at 5, it's like, why are you going to risk a 20 or 30 or $50 million satellite to save a few $1 million on the launch side? Just doesn't, because once you have a failure, it sets you back quite a ways. So I think on the launch side, we feel fairly protected given the timing and kind of our position. On the larger side of the launch market, SpaceX has kind of done a similar thing, except for the fact that, that portion of the market is so large, it can't, and for lots of different reasons, including, congressional law, you need more than one provider. Right, so I think that's what creates the opportunity for somebody to come in and be a competitor. I think if we end up being the dominant number 2 behind SpaceX, that's not a bad place to be.
So that was kind of my next question. What's it like to compete with SpaceX? Be it that it seems like they just have deep pockets.
Yeah, probably one of the scariest things about competing with SpaceX is to that point, is Elon seems to have an unlimited ability to raise capital, right? So he's playing with massive pools of capital. But we've kind of grown up with that context, right? So we've had to do things differently and to be cost competitive, and so we're going to apply those same things to Neutron. So we're not afraid of competing with them on a fair and level basis. I think that, but oftentimes we see him maybe doesn't play on a fair and level basis either. So it's definitely that is one thing that does keep us up at night. So launch demand is not that, but how do you basically kind of manage that dynamic with somebody unloaded capital and a very got to give it to the organization. I mean, SpaceX has been a phenomenal executor in an industry that's not known for phenomenal execution.
Yeah. And then maybe just changing gears a bit, where do you get people from to work? I mean, how's attracting labor, retaining labor been? I mean, when you look across the aerospace and defense sector in general, that's been tough for companies. How's it been for you guys?
It's not been that bad. So when I joined the company, I'm coming up on my 6th year later this month, and there were about 100 people when I joined. Now we're close to 2,000 people. And we have the benefit of so we have about 800 people in New Zealand, so large presence there. So we're a pretty big fish in a relatively small pond there. We're a place that people want to work. We attract talent there. And the interesting thing about New Zealand is you can actually hire people from around the world to work in New Zealand. But in the U.S., you're limited to U.S. people for ITAR reasons. So it actually provides a really nice growth and kind of a base to attract talent from places. We have a lot of people in New Zealand that come from France and Germany and the UK and Canada and so forth. So we've had tremendous success hiring in New Zealand. It's actually a really good cost basis too. It's a much cheaper place to operate it than in the U.S. So in the U.S. we have over 1,000 people, almost 1,200 people, and those are spread out between Long Beach, Denver, Albuquerque, Stennis, Mississippi, Wallops, Virginia, Middle River, Maryland, Silver Springs, Maryland, Toronto. So we've got pretty good diversified footprint. And I think at the end of the day, people they want to work for a platform that they think is going to be successful, and so a lot of them believe in that end-to-end model that we talk about. We probably hire, I'd say probably 20 to 25% of our people fresh out of school. So we've got a pretty good feeder programs into multiple universities around the world. We do end up hiring quite a few people from traditional aerospace primes because I think they find that it's a much more dynamic work environment. They're given much more responsibility than kind of in a more of a stuffy, more established location. We also offer pretty generous equity versus, again, people that don't get to participate in those in these larger traditional primes. And then we build talent from within, right? We basically again, take relatively raw materials and kind of develop those skills and capabilities internally. So, but we haven't really. It's not really been a problem. I mean, yes, we've hired some people out of SpaceX because that's typically after about 3 years they've kind of had enough of that. And then I would say that again the traditional aerospace, the Raytheons, the L3 Harrises, the Lockheeds, and the Boeings, all those kind of we get talent from those places as well.
And then, how should investors think about top-line growth broadly going forward?
So top-line growth, we've got a nice year teed up for 2024. Coming off again a good growth year in 2023. It's really going to be driven by Electron cadence. So continue to grow that cadence, and we have a pretty strong pipeline for that business relative to even where we were last year. Neutron's going to be a big enabler of growth. So when you start, right now when you sell Electron, you're selling roughly, call it $7.5 to $8 million per launch. Neutron kicks that up to kind of $50 to $60 million, and then really adding chunky space systems elements to the backlog around these satellite manufacturing contracts. So we're continuing to chase opportunities that are similar in magnitude to the SDA contract. So, when you land those big contracts, it kind of just de-risks your revenue forecast for the next several years, just given the nature of those programs. So we're chasing those hard. We've been able to double our backlog, year on year. So, I think that we just got to, now we got over $1 billion of backlog, and now it's when can we turn that into $2 billion of backlog and keep driving, kind of more secure growth. I think one thing that's really interesting about the dynamic that we find ourselves in is in most high growth companies, there's typically your hockey stick elements of your revenue pipeline are really driven by usually commercial opportunities that have their own financing risks and so forth. But right now we're really kind of the best of both worlds, where the U.S. government is the hockey stick, right? And they're known programs, and so we've got, I would say, financially lower risk, much higher programmatic certainty. So our growth isn't really underpinned at all by these kind of speculative, commercial mega constellations that are, So I actually really like where we're at, because you got all the benefits of growth and all the certainty of government.
And then maybe we're running out of time, but just a point to wrap up on. How's the cash flow for the company proceeding, and maybe with and without the development of Neutron?
So Neutron is consuming about $40 million a quarter between R&D, which is large. Yeah, it's kind of, if you look at our R&D spend for Neutron, it's half prototyping, half direct labor. And then about 20 million or half of the total cash flow related to the program is related to capex spend.
Yeah.
So you're going to see that continue through the remainder of 2024. But as we get toward that first launch, that's going to start to taper off. We budgeted the program initially at $250 to $300 million, and right now, given those, we were coming in a little bit underneath that until we pushed the program a couple quarters. Now we're bumping up against that higher limit of $300 million across R&D and capex. But we exited Q1 with $565 million of liquidity, and the Electron and Space Systems parts of the business. If they were kind of measured on a standalone basis, they're not cash consumers, right? They're cash generators. So as those elements of the business continue to grow, that'll help kind of manage that continued investment in Neutron. But we're all very much looking forward to that first Neutron launch, where you now pivot from heavy R&D investment now to revenue cover, and really moving a lot of those costs into COGS, and then we'll continue to invest in Neutron. It typically takes about 3 years to kind of harden a rocket. So you'll do annual block upgrades to give you more functionality, buy down risk, improve the yield on certain subsystems. But the rate of spend should decline from an R&D perspective. And again, you've got the benefit of now you've got paying customers helping kind of carry that water.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, thank you.